Hey everybody, I am Nikki Vachon, she, her pronouns. Thanks for joining us, Pathways for Unique Situations. We work with a lot of students that, like, people come to us say this is a really complicated situation, and sometimes it's not even complicated. It's a lot less complicated than people might think. So we really want to make sure that you are in the chat telling us what your questions are as we go. But I'm going to let my partners introduce themselves. Michelle, you want to go ahead?
Hi, everybody. I am Michelle. I'm a college access counselor as well. I'll be taking up the tail end presentation and bringing you hopefully into the final hours before your weekend.
I'm Mila Tappan. I use she, her pronouns as well. And yeah, so I'm going to do the middle section. And so we're so excited that you're here with us. But please do, we do think we have plenty of time for questions in this section. So whether you want to put them in the chat, we're monitoring that. To be honest, we're a fairly small group. You can unmute yourself or raise your hand. We want to be sure you get your questions answered. So thank you.
Go ahead, Michelle. There we go. I'm a visual learner, guys, and I always like to how are we going to get to the top of this mountain? How are we going to get this FAFSA through the finish line? Okay, and there's a lot of different pathways that are actually built into the FAFSA so that there are different ways to get that FAFSA done. It just might be a different pathway. So I'm going to start with those built-in regular questions that kind of get at whether or not someone's considered independent or dependent. Mila's going to go with it's complicated and then talk about parents that refuse to file the FAFSA. Michelle is going to bring us home with those students that are living independently and some students that are ineligible students. So let's go ahead and let's jump right in. So let's just talk about for a second, when the FAFSA considers you a dependent student, a lot of people confuse this with the IRS version of whether they're dependent on our taxes. And actually, when we talk about dependency on the FAFSA, we're talking about dependent for FAFSA purposes. So what that means is if someone is considered a dependent student, we need parent information on the FAFSA. If the FAFSA considers them independent, no parent information is needed. Sometimes maybe we need a spouse information if that parent's married. I mean, if the student is married. So when I say dependent versus independent, this is only for FAFSA purposes, has nothing to do with how the IRS figures out dependency. So the FAFSA has built-in questions that they walk you through to try to get at, are you a dependent or independent student? And the first one is really built in when they create their account. The FAFSA knows how old you are. And if the student is 24 years old or older as of December 31st of that award year, they're considered independent. No parent information is going to be needed just simply based on their age, right? If the student is married currently, maybe they're under 24, but they're married, they would be considered independent. No parent information is needed. Or does the student have children or people they financially support? Or do they have people who are dependent on them? If they do, we can check that off and they are considered independent. No parent information is needed. All right. So that's kind of the beginning part of this whole scavenger hunt. So go ahead, Michelle. And within the FAFSA, we get this series of questions. And if you can check any of these boxes off, right? Their student's going to be considered independent and no parent information is needed. And this section, I think words are super important, but also be thinking about how we're going to document that. Because sometimes the school may ask, like, did you answer this correctly? Like, we need to really make sure that you do fit the scenario for this. So they may ask for documentation. So let's go down this list and say, is this student currently serving on active duty in the U.S. Armed Forces for purposes other than training? So some people who are under age 24 might be just training. They don't meet the qualification to check this off. So we can't check that box off. Is the student a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces? So keep in mind the school may ask for documentation that you are a veteran. It's not super common, but if they do have to document it, we need a copy of their DD 214, which is the paperwork that comes from the military, and they have to have a status of anything other than a dishonorable discharge. does the student have children or other people, excluding their spouse, who live with them and receive more than half of their support between the academic year? And I've had students where both people, both parents, like maybe one person who is the student doesn't provide all the financial support. Maybe the other parent provides most financial support. We would not be able to check that off, even though they are a parent. Like the wording of this is really important. At any time since the student turned 13, were they an orphan, no longer living with biological or adoptive parents? So at any time since turning 13, do they meet that status? We can check that off if they do meet that status. No parent information would be needed going forward. And then, or the same thing at any time since they turned 13, were they a ward of the court? Were they in foster care? I worked with someone recently whose parent was going to do the FAFSA for them. They were in foster care at age 15 and then got adopted later. So the parent is thinking they need to fill out parent information, but because they were in foster care after age 13, they could check this off. They'd be considered independent. No parent information would be needed. So that's where that wording is important. Or the student is or was legally emancipated minor as determined by a court in their state of residence. So if they are a Maine resident, but they were emancipated in New Hampshire, they wouldn't be able to check that box off. So that's another one where that's important. And then this is where I find a lot of my students who have those complicated situations. Is the student or was the student in legal guardianship with someone other than a parent or step parent as determined in the court in their state of residence, right? So that's the wording is important there. A lot of students that I work with that might have a complicated situation, the first thing I'm gonna say, like, are you in legal guardianship? Like, as a court said, someone other than your parent is now your guardian, because that's where a lot of my students will fit in, is that last box. Okay, go ahead, Michelle.
Nikki, can I add one thing
Oh,
before we,
please,
sorry,
go back.
sorry. I was just going to go back to, because you said this, but I just wanted to reiterate it, that like with the foster care one, it's anytime since turning 13, and you did the example of becoming adopted. One of the things that we have seen with kids that are in foster care is they might go in and out of foster care. So, maybe at 14, they're in foster care, and then maybe there's a reunification that happens. Even if that reunification happens, as Nikki said, these words really matter. They would still check yes to that box, and they would still then they would be considered independent, and they would not have to provide any parent information. So I just wanted to highlight that, because we do see that those students in particular can move in and out of foster care. So if any time, regardless of what the status is today, if at any time since turning 13 they were in foster care, they can check that and will be considered independent.
And let me add one more thing to that. Sorry, Michelle, can you go back one more?
Sorry.
Sorry, I will move on after this. On the left-hand side, I did note for documentation, foster care, the school is not necessarily required to document that you were in foster care, and this documentation is pretty wide open. That can be documented in a bunch of different ways. But the school may ask to make sure that you really did answer that question correctly. So not to panic when you get these requests for documentations. This is the school, that's their job to make sure that you did answer. And I do have people that think they were in foster care and they weren't actually in foster care. So I mean, like, we want to make sure that we are doing this correctly. Okay, now Michelle, let's go. Okay, so let's talk about unaccompanied and homeless students. And this is another place where those words are important, okay? So at any time on or after, and this date changes every year with the FAFSA, after July 1st of 2024 was the student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. Unaccompanied means that they are not like with a parent, okay? So this is, they are not living with a parent. If a student is in a homeless shelter with their parents, they don't meet the status, right? So we're unaccompanied and, okay? So, and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of homeless. And a lot of students might answer this incorrectly because they're self-supporting. They don't live with their parents. I'm going to answer yes to this question, so I don't need to list my parents' information. Well, they don't really necessarily meet that status, a lot of students are self-supporting, right? So if the student's unaccompanied and homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless, and self-supporting risk of homeless might mean that they're couch surfing but working, right? They're living with a boyfriend in their apartment, but their name isn't on the lease. Like, this is situations that are kind of tenuous, that there might be at risk of being homeless at any point in time. So that's where they would meet that criteria. If we feel we meet that criteria and we check yes to this, these questions down below pop up. And we have to figure out who can document this for us, right? Can you click one time, Michelle? If we can document that maybe a director of a shelter or a high school liaison, like the McKinney-Vento liaison, or the director of a TRIO or Gear Up program, or a financial aid administrator can say, yes, they do actually meet this criteria, they're going to be considered independent. They can fill out the FAFSA without any parent information. Okay. So if we say that none of these apply, go ahead, Michelle, you know, click one more time. Go ahead and keep going. If they say no one can document this, we realize we have to follow up with the financial aid office. If no one can document this, the student's going to be considered provisionally independent, meaning they can finish the FAFSA without parent information, but they're going to have to follow up with the financial aid office. They will get a student aid index that will be calculated. The student aid index is the end result of the FAFSA, right? So when we fill out the FAFSA, it takes into account all these pieces of data, and it comes up with this number, and that's the student aid index. And that number is what we use to determine what aid they qualify for. So the student aid index will be calculated. The student is going to have to follow up with the financial aid office to document the status. We're going to have to document that they do actually meet the criteria. But one of the cool things that has changed is that if they are set to independent in 1 year, that independency status is going to carry over from year to year as long as they remain at the same school and their situations haven't changed. So keep in mind that students in this situation, it's often fluid, right? So they may be homeless, but again, like, they may reunite with their parents, and maybe next year they would be considered a dependent student. So that can happen. So just keep in mind that does, if they stay at the same situation and they're at the same school, they can keep that going from year to year. Okay. So let's talk about documenting this situation. In 2015, Department of Ed put out guidance on this because the Department of Ed does not need to know why a student is homeless. We don't want a student having to explain to a stranger in the financial aid office year after year the trauma that they went through to become into this situation. So we don't need to justify why someone is homeless. They just need to document that they do meet the criteria. And sometimes, you know, this might be an email written by the student. It could be just a conversation with the financial aid office. They often are asked for another adult in their life, like a employer or, you know, a family friend or someone that knows of the situation. Sometimes the school counselor or someone working with them that might be able to document this situation for them as well, to say that they do meet the criteria. We don't need to say why they're homeless, okay? And again, after 2023-24 award year, that people are still going to be processed as an independent student because of that status they had in their file. It's going to stay the same. And in fact, if the student transfers to another school the next year, the new school can say, hey, I can see that you met this status at another school. They can accept that as documentation to keep them homeless. And before we move on to It's Complicated with Mila, I just want to stop and see if we have any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. If we have any questions, I don't see any. All right, so I'm gonna hand it over to Mila.
All righty. So what about these students who, you know, the FAFSA takes into account so many unusual circumstances, but what if a student wasn't able to check off any of these were applicable to their situation. So if a student is not independent based on any of the previous information, then they will see this question. So if they've said they're, in legal guardianship, they won't ever see this question. But if they get all the way through, they're still looking like they're a dependent student, but they can't provide parent information, then they have the opportunity to say that. So it will ask them if they have unusual circumstances that prevent them from contacting their parents or would put them at risk if they did. This is what we always in the past referred to as a dependency override. So they're not independent on paper, but they've got unusual circumstances that the financial aid office can take into consideration and where appropriate can basically override that dependency status and make them an independent student for the purposes of financial aid. If the student does have these unusual circumstances, which we will discuss in more detail in a moment, they should answer yes, and they will be considered provisionally independent. So if a student says, I'm in that situation, I've got all this stuff happening, I wasn't able to answer yes to any of these questions, but I'm in a situation where I cannot provide parent information, this is where they say yes. And there are some examples here. So if a student, for example, is experiencing an unusual circumstance, maybe they've left home due to an abusive situation or a threatening environment, if they are abandoned or estranged from their parents, if they have refugee or asylee status and are separated from their parents. So you can see that there are several circumstances that the student will see right up front, and they can say, oh, that's me. That's what I have going on. They would click yes to that box. They will be considered provisionally independent, just like what Nikki just talked about. They will be able to finish their FAFSA all on their own without any parent information, and a student aid index will be calculated. Now, the student will need to follow up with the financial aid office to document their status. So that's the really key piece. And in a moment, we're going to talk about that documentation and what that includes. But if the student is approved, their unusual circumstances are approved, then that independent status will carry forward over to the next year and going forward as long as they stay at the same school and their circumstances remain unchanged. Now, to that point, I do want to say that we have seen some cases this year where a student was considered to have unusual circumstances, that AKA dependency override was done. It should have automatically carried forward for this year, but the school did request additional documentation again. We simply reached back out to the school, provided the language from the Department of Ed that said that they did not have to redocument that every year if the circumstances hadn't changed. So financial aid offices are getting used to some of these changes. So if you have a situation where you're thinking, gosh, I thought Nikki and Mila and Michelle said that if their circumstances didn't change, they didn't need to redocument this every year. That is correct, but we might see some schools that are still questioning that. So if you ever need assistance with this part of the process, want to talk about it with us, we're happy to reach out to the schools as well. So please just let us know. Next slide, Michelle, please. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about these unusual circumstances. Let's dive in a little bit more. So, we mentioned a few of them that show up on that slide that the student will see when completing their FAFSA. Human trafficking, those that are legally granted refugee status or asylum status. Those are some situations. That said, I think for the most part, we tend to see students who have been abandoned by their parents or are in a situation where it's just not safe and healthy for the student to be interacting with their parents. So what we don't want to have happen through this process is we don't want students who have already been through traumatic situations to be re-traumatized, to try to reach out to their parent, to get them to complete the FAFSA and to navigate this process. I will say right up front, how schools deal with this is different. Some schools are a little more flexible. Some schools are a little bit more strict. But we do want to be sure that the attempt is made if the student does have these situations, to have the student say yes to the unusual circumstance and then follow up with the school. A couple of examples I just wanted to share in the past that I've experienced is I remember when I was working at UMaine, I had a student and he was home on break and he was trying to, get his father to fill out the FAFSA, and it was a very contentious relationship. And he was only home, just for that day, just for that purpose. He otherwise was not living at home. He was living on campus. And the conversation between the dad and the son escalated to the point I literally called the police. I called 911. I knew where the student was located because I was so afraid that the student was going to be, physically abused. He certainly was being verbally abused. That was a situation where I was able to document the police report. We did that. We did that unusual circumstance, that dependency override, because there was no reason for that student to have to be in that situation. We do, if students' parents are incarcerated, that potentially will be an unusual circumstance where a student can be considered independent. Another had seen a lot of things through the years. I had a student one time whose parent had killed his mother. So mom had died and then dad was incarcerated. Obviously, that was an unusual circumstance, a very straightforward one. We're able to document that and consider the student to be independent. I will say, though, that a parent simply being incarcerated is not enough to be an unusual circumstance always. Because what happens is if there are two parents involved, the school does want the student to be taking into account both of those parents. So, there may be the one parent that's incarcerated, but a relationship still exists with that other parent. Maybe they live with them, maybe they don't, but nonetheless, there is a relationship there. It is possible and feasible for that other parent to fill out the FAFSA. So one parent being incarcerated is not going to create an unusual circumstance, but it certainly is a situation that should be investigated and discussed to learn more about, because maybe there is something more that's taking place. Another situation that Nikki alluded to a moment ago is that we have a lot of students who are in legal guardianship. And so if they're in legal guardianship, they are automatically considered independent. I think it's very rare that any of us do a financial aid night and we don't have a grandparent come up to us. Either during the session, they might raise their hand or come up to us afterwards and say, I have my grandchildren living with me. This is so common and seems to be increasingly common. And, the grandparent says, so how do we fill out the FAFSA? The first question I'm going to ask is, do you have legal guardianship? And if the grandparent says, yes, I have legal guardianship, great. They say yes to that question. I will tell you, I've got sirens going off in the background and my dogs lose their minds. So I don't think you can hear any of it, but they are really losing it. So the grandparent, if they do have legal guardianship, the student's going to indicate that they are in legal guardianship. It's only the student's information on the FAFSA. They're considered independent. If the grandparent says, no, I don't have legal guardianship, then we're going to have a more detailed conversation. I'm going to get personal really, really quickly, and I'm going to ask for some of the reasons why the student is living with them. If the student is living with them because one parent maybe is off the radar, no contact, the other parent maybe has some mental health issues, some drug addiction issues, and that the student isn't safe living with the parent, that's going to be an unusual circumstance. So we're going to go down that path. We're going to say, yes, check the unusual circumstance box, and let's work with the school to get that dependency override or those unusual circumstances approved and consider that student independent. Now, there are other occasions where a grandparent will say, he just likes living with me more, we get along great, but there is a relationship with the parent. In that case, if there's no abuse, if there's not a broken relationship, if it's not harmful for the student, we are going to say that the parent does need to fill out the FAFSA. And sometimes that's no big deal, right? The parent can do that. Even though they are not living in the same household, that parent is able to go ahead. It's not traumatizing to the student, and that's how that process would get completed. Okay, so this is why we're doing this session, right? And this is why we want your questions, and this is why we want you to know that if you have situations, just give us a call and we'll walk through kind of, okay, this or that. We have all these decision trees that we make a decision at, and that will dictate how the student fills out the FAFSA. But we are here to help with that. But I do want to be sure that you know, which is because it's really frustrating because we're seeing this more and more, that there are some circumstances that don't qualify as unusual circumstances. So a student's parent simply refusing to fill out the FAFSA, no go. That's not an unusual circumstance. It's not a reason for a school to consider the student independent. Parent just not being willing to provide any information. The student's parents not claiming them on the tax return. As we talk about a lot in the financial aid realm, how people fill out their taxes does not dictate whether a student is dependent or independent. A parent can claim a student on their tax return, or maybe they say they're not going to claim a student on their tax return, not because they think it will make them independent. Not claiming a student on a tax return does not, in and of itself, in any way, shape, or form, make that student independent. There'd have to be something more going on. So those are circumstances where that would not be the case. And we'll talk about what options exist in those scenarios in just a moment. Michelle, if you want to, okay. So in the case where we've said, yes, there are unusual circumstances taking place, the student checks that box, they're able to complete the FAFSA with only their information, but then they do need to follow up with the financial aid office, because the financial aid office will have to document this circumstance the first time around. One of the things that we have seen the federal government do, thankfully, is be more flexible about how this documentation can be provided. So, for example, a documented interview between the student and the financial aid administrator is now considered one type of documentation that is allowable. Many schools require 2 pieces of documentation in order to do this. And I always want people to keep in mind that if the school is a bit strict about this, it's because they get audited. So, Nikki and I both worked in financial aid offices. We remember when the auditors came. We remembered when they pulled those files. And I wanted to be sure that I could verify to an auditor, I could document to an auditor why I had made the decision I had made. So, financial aid people are going to run kind of the spectrum, but at the end of the day, they do have to be sure that when they're making this decision, they are doing it for legitimate reasons that they can demonstrate to an auditor. Okay, so usually they're going to require 2. Certainly court orders are things that could do that. As I mentioned, if you've got a police report about a parent being aggressive with a student, that probably is going to go a long way toward that. Documented phone calls with the state or county tribal welfare agencies, independent case workers who are aware of the situation. Maybe, some of these students are working with other bodies who can verify their situation. One of the nice expansions in the last couple of years, both on the homeless side, but also on this side, is that TRIO and Gear Up are absolutely people who are often aware of a student situation and can be the people who write that letter, that documentation. School counselors, all of the time, it seems like we are seeing school counselors that are very aware of the student situation, and they can be a source of that documentation. If that documentation was gathered by another school and a student transferred to a new school, the old school's documentation of that could be obtained by the new school, and that would be sufficient. Now, this last category where we talk about utility bills, health insurance, and other documents that demonstrate the student is separated from their parents or legal guardians, that in and of itself is not sufficient for a student to be considered independent. Living independently, paying for yourself, taking care of yourself is not. But it can, in combination with these other pieces of documentation, show that the student is estranged from their parents. So if they're paying for their own bills, and then on top of that, you have someone who says, this situation is dangerous for the student. They've moved out and they're living on their own because the police had to be called to basically intervene between the parent and the student. That could be that second piece of documentation. So there's a lot of flexibility here, but at the end of the day, this financial aid office just wants to be sure that when an auditor says to them, why did you do this? They can say, this is why, and they can show that that was an appropriate decision to be made. Because when students are considered to be independent, oftentimes they are then going to be eligible for the maximum amount of a Pell Grant and maximum amounts of other types of aid. So that's why the school wants to be sure that they can justify that. But good news again, as Nikki mentioned with the homeless students, once they provide that documentation one time, they should not need to do this year after year. I'd love to think that the FAFSA going, as we continue and continues to be updated, that maybe that would actually show up on the FAFSA as carrying forward. We'll see if that happens. But right now, the students should just every year indicate, answer yes to that question. Okay, next slide. And then the last little bit for me, I just want to talk about parent refusal to provide information. As we mentioned, there are sometimes parents who refuse to participate in any part of this process. They will not create their studentaid.gov account, or we're trying to transition away from FSA ID because that's what federal student aid is doing. So parents won't create that studentaid.gov account. They don't want to share tax information or income information. They don't want to provide any information. Sometimes the parents haven't filed taxes and they're all, worried about that and what's going to happen and people are going to find out. So a couple of points before we talk about what options exist. We always want to try to convince the parents to go ahead and to complete this part of the process and to support their students. If they are thinking, well, I don't want to fill out the FAFSA because then I'm going to be on the hook for paying for part of my student's higher education. That's not the case. There is no one that can make a parent pay anything for their student's education. All completing the FAFSA does is open up the door to all of those federal and state and institutional resources that are available. So in no way is the parent obligated. If the parents didn't file taxes, maybe they weren't required to file taxes. And the reality is that, at least at this point in time, we still want the student to go ahead and file the FAFSA. They can indicate that the parent hasn't filed taxes. There's a couple of scenarios where that is appropriate. They can check yes to that, and they can get the FAFSA still completed. We also want people to know that the way that the FAFSA works now with income information coming directly from the IRS, that doesn't even show up in a tax on the FAFSA. So first of all, the FAFSA is now roles-based, so the student and parent segments are separated. But even if the student is looking at the parent information, say on the FAFSA submission summary, none of the tax information shows if it comes from the IRS. So parents can, feel more comfortable that if they don't want their kids to see their tax information, they're not going to. So hopefully we can convince the parents to go ahead and complete this process and help their students be eligible to access this aid. But ultimately, if they're not, the student is considered to be a dependent student. They don't meet any of the criteria that we've talked about so far today. They can say that their parents are refusing to provide information on the FAFSA. And if they answer yes to that, the student can complete the FAFSA on their own with just their information, but they will only be eligible for an unsubsidized student loan. Now, that's better than nothing. There was a long time when they just weren't eligible for anything. And then, I don't know, I've lost track of time, maybe a decade or more ago, the federal government said, you know what, in these situations, we are going to open up unsubsidized loan only. So Michelle, if you can go to the next slide. If a student says yes to that, that their parents are refusing, then the student can, again, finish their FAFSA off. An SAI will not be calculated, and the student will only be eligible for unsub. There is another piece of documentation that is needed. There will need to be a statement signed that the student's parents refuse to complete the FAFSA, or that the student's parents do not and will not provide any financial support to the student, including the date that ended. This used to be an and statement. It is now an or statement. So there is that one additional step. So they can check that off on their FAFSA, but then one of those two types of statements need to be signed. If the parent refuses to sign that statement saying, hey, I'm not going to provide any information, then someone else is going to have to document that. That's not going to just fly with the student saying that's the case. So some third party would need to document that. So as a school counselor or a trio counselor or other type of access counselor, you may well know that the parents are refusing to do this. You could write that statement to say that there is a refusal on the parent side. And then I think it's always worth, when the parents refuse to provide information, it's always worth having a conversation about what more might be going on in the household. Maybe there are other circumstances. Maybe the easy thing to say is my parents just won't fill out the FAFSA, but maybe there's something more. Maybe it is abusive. Maybe the student's not living at home. Maybe they're homeless. Maybe there's just something that they don't want to necessarily talk about. So I think that, you know, again, we get really personal really quickly with students sometimes, but doing that helps us sometimes reveal that there is more going on, and we want to know that so that we can help the student access the maximum amount of financial aid possible. All right, that's what I had. So over to you, Michelle, to take us home.
Milo,
Yeah,
before we move in,
Yeah.
we have a question in the chat.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay.
What if the student is doing the FAFSA just to get free community college, and they answer yes to this question about the parent not providing the information? Is that enough for people to access free community college?
Yes, the student does need to fill out the FAFSA, so they would have filled out the FAFSA. I, in that circumstance, would still recommend, though, that the student touch base with an advisor at the community college. I think there are some community colleges that might just say that's sufficient. I think there are going to be other situations where they just want to have a conversation with the student and document it to some extent, that they are going to be eligible for free community college. Just because I do think we have a moment, I'm just going to say about the whole free community college piece, because there's still some confusion. I mean, we've had this program around for years. We hope it will continue. But when the student wants to go to community college and they are in that bucket of students that are eligible, the reason they need to do a FAFSA is because if they are eligible for a Pell Grant, if they are eligible for a Maine State Grant, that's actually what will cover their tuition and fees. Because we want to be sure that, you know, we are looking to other funding only after funding that's already available to the students. In a case of a student who says that their parents aren't willing to provide information, of course, they're not going to be eligible for a Pell Grant or a state grant. So that does mean that the community college is going to have to fully fund that. That's why I think the conversation with the community college is a good thing, just to be proactive. That being said, wonderful that the community college has been really, really flexible. They will make sure that those students whose parents are unwilling to file the FAFSA are indeed eligible to get free community college. Students who are not eligible to file the FAFSA because of citizenship status are going to be able to work with their advisor and get their tuition covered and get free community college. So the school will definitely be flexible. The only thing I hesitate on a little bit is I just don't want to go with the assumption that just because they fill out their FAFSA that way, that they won't still need to have a conversation with someone on campus. Any other thoughts, Nikki or Michelle, on that?
No, that's it. That's it. Covered it. Sorry, Michelle, didn't mean to interrupt you.
please, no, that was not an interruption. That was a great segue to our last real category that we're talking about here. We talked about it a little bit throughout the presentation, but living independently is kind of this last portion here that we want to make sure that we touch on. So remembering that students just being under the age of 24 and living on their own, financially supporting themselves, that alone is not enough for financial aid purposes to be kind of qualified as independent. If they don't have any of the other circumstances that we've already talked about, the student themselves might feel a little bit stuck because they feel like they can pay for college on their own, or they don't want to get their parents' information, or, you know, they can't even get their parents' information. And this might be incredibly frustrating for them. But it kind of, this is the circumstance that we're in. So what you would normally do is make sure you have them go back and look at that student unusual circumstances, that dependency override questions, just to make sure that there's not something that fits. So kind of like what Milo was just saying is, in these situations, like, really dig a little bit deeper, figure out maybe why exactly this is going on and see if it fits into that bucket so that you can get the student to the finish line. And then lastly, just ineligible students, talking about what resources are available for them. I know we just talked a little bit about the free community college portion, and that's totally something that might be available for asylum seekers as well. So have them talk directly to the school, kind of that process that Milo was talking about. Also, there are a fair amount of resources regarding outside scholarships that are available. We have great resources on our website regarding scholarships for new Mainers, and obviously the wonderful Flo, who specializes in that area. So she's a great resource if you have specific questions about new Mainers who are seeking asylum that may not be eligible for federal student aid. She's a great resource, somebody to reach out to and have a conversation with, and connect students with. Also, we have our one-on-one booking appointments that are available if anybody needs to sit down and figure out some of these unusual circumstances and wants to be able to explain exactly what's going on and walk through that with one of us. That's what I had. So, questions, anybody?
Love to hear someone's unusual situation they have.
Love to. While you're thinking, maybe let me just add that yesterday we had our weekly meeting, and Florica was so excited because she had come in contact with a new organization, and one of the people at that organization was someone who was not eligible for federal student aid based on her citizenship status, but she had found a way to pay for her whole undergraduate education through scholarships. So Flo's connecting with that individual, and so I think that there are just so many pathways and so many options available to pay for higher education. I'll be honest, we try to be aware of all of them. I'm sure we don't know about absolutely everything, but we would love to have you come talk with us about your situations. And also, if you find a really cool resource, share that back with us. We would love that as well, because obviously we're all working on this together to try to get these students to a place where they can get whatever education works for them, go whichever pathway works for them, but have that ability to have employment and a secure future. So
I
Stop
gotta
the
say,
recording.
been doing this since 1997, Michelle, when we were born. Just
I was born in 98.